And now we're going to have somebody from the NIH, Alan DeCherney, to talk from the NIH perspective, and also from a somewhat more, how shall I put it, Alan? Controversial or conservative perspective.
Well, that's why I wanted to go after Sam.
I mean, go after in one way or the other.
Do I get a 30-second rebuttal?
Yes.
Well, I also wanted to go after Sam because I like to mix you up.
I
know how
Alan,
obsessive
okay.
you are. Now, Sam, I have a story about his mother in that she was the first Yale resident to get pregnant. So
sure, that's just what your mother wants to hear.
That's
she was
going to be
one of
her
the first
tombstone.
women. The rest of the residents were not capable of getting pregnant because they were males.
Yes.
And I ran the residency, and I said she could have 2 weeks off for her pregnancy and delivery. And she came to me and said, "That's not fair. I need at least a month." I said, "Well, that's okay. We'll give you a month, and it'll include your vacation." And then Sam's father came to talk to me, who was a distinguished, extremely serious scientist. And he said, "This is not acceptable. She's still going to get her 2 weeks vacation, so she'll be taking 6 weeks off for her pregnancy." And that actually became the precedent at Yale that still exists, that they give 6 weeks off for maternity leave. So you're
mom.
Huh?
Hey,
Your mom,
proud of her.
a trailblazer. Okay, so we're going to talk about we'll talk about the NIH. First, I want to talk a little bit about the structure of the NIH. Then I'll talk about the finances of the NIH, and then I'll talk about then we'll talk a little bit how the sequester affected us. Now, where is the advance? Here we go. Okay. So you're completely free to carry out whatever research you want, as long as you come to these conclusions. So obviously, the NIH the research has a payoff, and it's an important payoff, and it's very dramatic and a very important issue to people. And you could see that in the talks, that when health care is impacted upon, no matter what it is, certainly the public gets upset, and it was a big mistake for the sequester to take on the NIH. The NIH is actually a bargain. Before the sequester, it was about $31 billion, and tremendous work comes out of the NIH. And I'm going to explain to you just in a moment that the NIH is not only what is in the campus in Bethesda. That only represents 10% of the NIH. The other 90% are institutions throughout the United States and actually throughout the world. So a good example, what happened? A good example is Yale University. Yale University gets about $200 million in research money from the NIH. So not only does it sequester or a cut impact work that occurs in Bethesda, but it also impacts work that happens in Los Angeles or New Haven or Philadelphia. So this has profound economic impact throughout the country when NIH funds are cut, and not only on scientists, but on people that work at these various universities when things are cut back. Now, the intramural program, the intramural program is out in Bethesda. It's very much like any other research university. This is Rockefeller, and there are 17 institutes: the Cancer Institute, NIDDK, that looks at diabetes, NICHD, which is women and children health. These all carry out research on the spot. Now, what most people don't know is that there's a hospital on the campus. It's a 300-bed research hospital, and anyone can come to that hospital. This is a picture of the hospital. Anyone can come to that hospital from anywhere in the world, and if you can't afford it, transportation is paid for, and the care is totally free. And many of the breakthroughs that you're familiar with have come from work done at the NIH in the local campus. So the average age of the population that works there is between 45 and 48. People work there a long period of time, but I mainly show this that this is a gigantic place with almost 19,000 employees and 6,500 scientists. So this is a very productive place, but also it's a large place, and you can imagine how a cut in the budget makes a giant impact at this place. Now, I want to explain a little bit about the personalities of people that work at the NIH. There are two kinds of investigators. One are MDs, and the others are PhDs. And their personality is totally different, and the way they look at things are very different. And the truth is, the MDs are less impacted by the sequester than the PhDs. On the left, on the left is Dr. Robbins. He's a pediatrician who developed many of the vaccines that are known. He's a member of the National Academy. He's received the Lasker Award, which, as you know, predates a Nobel Prize for about 80% of the people. The other is Dr. Dawood. He's a distinguished scientist who developed the zebrafish model to look at developmental biology. Interestingly enough, the developmental genes in the zebrafish in early development are the same genes that determine development in the human being. And he was a former editor of the Journal of the National Academy. Now, the difference in the personality is that Dr. Dawood, the PhD, he wants to go from point A to point B, and he doesn't want to be disturbed. He just wants to go from A to B. He's not very flexible. He's tremendously productive, but he's not very flexible. And in fact, we had Carol Greider speak to us last week, who just got the Nobel Prize 2 years ago from Johns Hopkins. And somebody asked her, she's not an MD, but I mean, she is an MD, but they asked her why, how do PhDs think? And she said they want to know more about one thing than anybody else in the world knows. And MDs are different. They want to go from A to B, but if C pops up, that's also good, and they'll explore that. So Dr. Robbins, for example, this is just an example. He's looking for a vaccine for E. coli, and cholera comes along. Well, he'll work on cholera for a while and then go back, or let somebody else work on cholera, and then he'll go back and look at E. coli. So these are different personalities, and they reacted totally different in a different fashion to the sequester based on their own training. So there are the four kinds of basic people there. There are research and clinical fellows. NIH is a giant training program. We ourselves have the largest reproductive endocrine fellowship in the country. There are staff scientists and staff clinicians who provide work in the laboratory, but they're not tenured. And then there are young investigators who are just starting their career, and then of course there are senior investigators who are the older group of senior people in the institution. And we have an education mission. We have a research mission, of course, which is the primary mission, and we also have a large clinical mission, as I mentioned. I mean, we have 15 operating rooms that work pretty much full-time, just to give you a sense of the clinical load that occurs there. So that's what the NIH looks at as far as an institution. Now, there are some sad stories associated with funding, but also associated with the changing in nature in medicine, in that the number of MD PhDs, or MDs that are interested in research, is declining rapidly. And this is a major problem because there's nobody to provide that interface between basic research and the bedside clinical research. This is occurring for two reasons. One, the funding is going down. In fact, it takes somebody to age 42 in order to get an R01, and that's the premier grant to carry out independent research. Well, by 42, if your career as an independent investigator is starting out when you're 42, I mean, that's pretty grim. The other thing, actually, before I went to the NIH 6 years ago, I was the chair of OBGYN at UCLA, and there, the doctors had to earn their salary. So as it got harder and harder to earn your salary, doctors had to spend 4 or 5 days a week seeing patients. There really wasn't any time to do research, and that's pretty much the way it has evolved today. So a sad thing, somewhat due to the sequester, but more due to the financial strains on academia. Academia tolls the bell for the end of the physician scientist, which I think is a major problem. And this comes from Leon Rosenberg. In the absence of physician scientists, the bridge between bench and bedside will weaken and perhaps even collapse. So this is something sad, and to be truthful, I don't see anything changing on the horizon. Now let's talk about the money at the NIH. This is a list of it's an old list. The numbers have changed, but the priority list is the same. NCI, of course, gets the most money. It's the largest institute. Heart, lung, and blood is next. And you can see that these are the most common diseases that patients die from. And you can see that we're number 5 on the list, which is depends on how you look at it, not bad. Appropriations have changed over the years. Under the Clinton administration, there was a doubling in the budget, but the budget has been pretty much flat up until the sequester. Now, the dispersion of the money, the blue circle is research grants, and of course this goes to the outside. You can see the 10%, the pink, that represents the intramural program, and you can see there are management fees that occur, and there are training grants that are done, as well as contracts in order to solve a certain problem. A good example of that is the contraceptive branch, where most of their work is not original research; it's mainly contraceptive testing throughout the world in order to control population growth. Now, this is probably the most important slide as far as money that I'll show. And the bottom line is the number of grants that are funded. And yes, in our institution, 12% of grants are funded. But the interesting thing that makes this more profound is the top line represents the number of proposals that are sent. So it's kind of the funding remains the same. Now, the money, of course, is not worth as much. $1 million in 2002 is not the same as $1 million in 2014. But nevertheless, this rapid growth of submissions, and this is a reflection of PhDs. And actually Leon Rosenberg, who I just quoted, came to speak. Maybe we're turning out too many PhDs. I mean, because we're providing people with promises that we're unable to fulfill because we just can't fund them. Of course, on the other hand, the sad part is, as Sam brought up, is people that are very talented and will make the great discoveries in the future perhaps are turned off because this is a non-discriminatory event. So once again, the numbers are in proportion, but still, industry funds much more research than the federal government does. But that's not the kind of research. Yes, we want that research. It develops new drugs, for instance, but it doesn't do basic research. It doesn't, because the people that work in industry have to have a payoff, and the payoff has to be quick. So now, just a couple of thoughts in conclusion. This is the National Children's Study. This is an $8 billion funded study to be carried out over the next 20 years. It's 5 years old now, so 100,000 children will be followed over their lifetime from preconception up until the age they're 20. Genetic material is collected. Toxins that they're exposed to are collected, and hopefully we'll have a natural history of what affects human beings from early childhood, actually in utero, through childhood, adolescence, and adulthood. So this is an important study, but this is an expensive study. $8 billion is a fairly large chunk out of the NIH overall budget. But the sequester, the government... as you heard, the government is supportive. The good thing about the government, though, is that it moves very slowly. And things that they threaten us with, they very rarely come to fruition. It's good, because if all these ideas that these guys had turned over every week, the country would be in chaos. And you can see that even the sequester, we had a 5%, the sequester was 5% of our total budget. Well, after a period of time, about 6 months, they announced that this going forward in 2015, it's only going to be a 1% cut. Okay, so that's a 1% cut. So 4% more money went into the pipeline, and eventually that will get out to the universities and come back to the individual branches. Then on top of that, there's a movement afoot to actually increase the budget to $32 million from $31 billion in fiscal year 2016. So things do work. Work out, and the government usually comes to the right conclusion, even though it's painful at first. But health is a good way to get money because everybody's involved. Everybody cares about their health. But as you said, the defenders doesn't affect a large piece of the general population. So my NIH grant had some money left over from last year. So there are a bright side to this. And in conclusion, what we're doing is we're searching for truth. We'd like to look to the left and look for the rich truth and with the abundance of funds, but also if we go to the right, we can find truth as well. Perhaps it's a little bit less money, but certainly overall the picture, I think, is bright and the product is good. Thank you.